about the educational context in the U.S. With non-English speakers. I want to move on now very briefly to give you a history, a language history of the United States, very brief. Because this gets erased. This kind of language diversity gets erased over time. We're not aware of it, but it certainly has been there and influences how we act today. Of course, Spanish was here first, even before English. In the southwestern United States, which were part of Mexico, and even before it was Mexico, it was New Spain. Florida, also, Spanish. Certainly New Orleans, also Spanish and French. There's French in the upper Midwest from French Canada, and that's part of the U.S., and it's called also in New England. French can be found, Canadian French can be found. And the mixed language I mentioned, Michif, also, which is Korean French. German is an extremely important language in U.S. language history. Germans especially congregated in the Middle Atlantic, the South, the Midwest, and the West. In particular around the Great Lakes, hundreds of thousands of German speakers over the course of the 1800s. One reference I found said that there were 500,000 German speakers in Chicago in 1900. That's an enormous amount, because I think Chicago was only 1 million at that point, so half the people could speak German. Another author, and this is a direct quote from Kamphoefner, Miami in 1968, i.e. Spanish speakers, pales in comparison with Milwaukee in 1868, that is, with German speakers. So even though we don't live back then now, your grandparents, your great-grandparents experienced this linguistic diversity. Or didn't. They might have lived in German enclaves where all they needed to know was German, to shop, to go to church, this has been the nature of U.S. history. There's also, and this is not widely known, but there's also a tradition of bilingual education in the United States. People get very upset about bilingual education, get anti-bilingual education, but we had bilingual education in German and English, many places in the Midwest. Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio still has German-English bilingual education, excellent program. St. Louis, Milwaukee, places in Wisconsin, you can still find German speakers. Places in Texas, you can still find German speakers. So there's a tradition, and I'm not talking about private language, religious schools or something. I'm talking about public schools. Public funding went to support bilingual education in German and English. So bilingualism in U.S. history is kind of a sad story, because we have lost so many languages over the generations. And as an adult, it's much harder to acquire a second or a third language than it is when you're a child. First of all, we had, I think, over 200 indigenous languages that were purposely eradicated, because the Indians were brought into boarding schools. They said you had to speak English. You were punished if you spoke your native language. These kids were taken away from their parents because supposedly they were going to be acculturated and become Americans that way. And periodically through history also, we've had anti-immigrant and English-only movements. This is not anything new. German Americans were harassed, asked to get off the sidewalk, for example. One was even lynched in Illinois. This is during the World War I period, when we were about to go to war with Germany and then did go to war with Germany. What happened to the German language after that is very sad. It was a lot of states enacted laws. You can't teach this language. Books were burned that were in German. There was, as I said, a lot of harassment of German citizens if they could be recognized as German speakers. The courts were inundated with name change requests so that German names were anglicized. People did not want to be under this kind of harassment, of course. Streets and parks names were changed from German to English. So German origins were obscured because people didn't want to be discriminated against. And the same thing is true of a lot of other immigrant languages. I know Polish in Chicago, for example, the same thing. All these languages have been kind of erased from our collective memory, but we've had a lot of languages in this country that unfortunately we have lost. Just to give you an example, it's on my PowerPoint. You probably cannot see it very well here, but it is. I have 2 slides on my PowerPoint that show German-American maps, heritage maps, based on the 1990 census, where people were able to put what their descent was. And of course, there were a lot of people of German descent who didn't even know they were of German descent anymore, who couldn't even answer that question. But the states are heavily concentrated around the Great Lakes, but there's a huge percentage of people with German heritage in particular regions. 3 states in particular stand out in the next slide I have, which you probably can't see, but you can look at it on my PowerPoint. Pennsylvania, we all know about the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is actually German, Deutsch. But Ohio is as heavily marked on this map as Pennsylvania, and surprisingly, interestingly enough, California. So those are the highest densities, even though, as I said, the highest numbers are around the Great Lakes. So today we have anti-immigrant ideologies once again, but as I said, you may think this is new, it's not new. Anxieties that people have about people who look different, whose culture is different, are displaced onto language. And so there's a fervor about English only that I think is really illogical. Instead you could promote bilingualism and we would still all speak English. Trust me, English is not in danger on this continent, in this country. English is taking over in 2nd and 3rd generation immigrants to the extent that they don't even know their heritage language anymore. An interesting little wrinkle in this anti-immigrant fervor that we see rising up every now and then is that businesses are very pro-immigrant. And this is because they want low-paid labor, and they are dependent on it, actually. So it's not as clear-cut a case as one might think. Globalization, as I said, is transforming the world. There's immigrants worldwide, 1 in 35 people. There's lots of multilingualism within national borders. Even with global English, there's a need for other languages in business and communication, international relations. I know a lot of people trying to learn Chinese because many people think that's the rising language, and we need to know that. The United States was caught short after 9/11 because we hadn't trained enough Arabic speakers. There are all kinds of arguments you could make for multilingualism in a society. At any rate, I'd like to sum up now with some recommendations. I have a bibliography on the PowerPoint, which you can consult at your leisure. But based on everything that I have argued today and all the research I've presented, I would like to make some recommendations for classrooms. 1, support heritage language maintenance and development, including literacy. I think it would be wonderful to have, as I said, not only bilingual populations, but biliterate populations. Number 2, acknowledge the validity of vernacular language varieties in English, in Spanish, in whatever. Acknowledging the validity of these language varieties does not mean you don't teach academic English. But it does argue that 3, we replace the ideology of contempt towards small dialects and languages with an ideology of respect. 4, we should value multilingualism over monolingualism as a society. And 5, we do teach the academic register of English and other languages if possible, because it is important. This is what education's about. Education is about change, about adding language capacities and cognitive capacities. I'm not arguing we shouldn't teach that. I teach that. I'm arguing we should respect what our students bring to us in the classroom, and also that we help them develop, if possible, their native languages so we have a more multilingual, capable citizenry. Thank you.